Hello everyone, thank you so much for joining again. And if this is the first time you join, welcome. My name is Marina Lantos and I am one of the core team members for East Coast Salon Services. Today's look is going to be a layered haircut using a feather razor. Stay tuned. Before we start our tutorial, I would like to go over a couple of things on how to use a razor and different strokes that we'll be going over today. So here's the razor. This is the guard. This is the razor that comes with it. It has the guard, so the blade is inside and the guard is covering the blade so that it is almost impossible to cut yourself. So usually the width of the blade minus the last and the first teeth is going to give us the width of the section. So about here, a little bit over an inch. We never want to really use a section that's going to be too skinny because that's going to give us too many room for mistakes. And if we use the blade fully, then the tension between the last blades instead of in comparison to the middle is going to be different. So we always want to keep the tension as precise as possible, just as when we're using our fingers. So a couple of things is we went over on the width of the blade. Now we're going to go over on how to hold the blade and the angle that we're going to be holding on. So come on over. All right, so we have a couple of different strokes. So we're going to call this one closed blade stroke. So when we're placing the blade and we want to remove just the length without creating any movement on texture, we're going to place the blade at about 45 degrees to the hair. So if this will be perpendicular, and we'll call it 0 degrees, and this will be flat and 180 degrees. That's why I never use degrees because it could get pretty confusing. But we will call this diagonal at about 45 degrees. So place the blade 45 degrees. And then we're going to close the blade, which means the movement, up and down movement, is going to be quite minimal. So when we're doing this, we're barely moving the blade. And this is how much texture we're going to create, right? So it looks almost serrated, but quite precise. So that is our closed blade movement. So the next movement that we're going to go over is going to be open blade movement. So open blade, the blade goes the same way against the hair at 45 degrees, but the movement is going to be much more open, which means the blade is going to go higher up and hit our fingers every time. Look at the difference. Look how much more texture that I created. So how you are using your blade and the movements that you're creating in your blade is going to be dictated by how much movement you want to see in your haircut. So for example, if someone comes in and they have pin straight hair and they want to see movement, you got to keep that blade open because you got to remove that weight from the ends of the hair. If someone comes in and they have frizzy hair or wavy hair or curly hair and you use that blade really open, you're going to release a lot of weight from the hair, which is going to make that hair spring up, and it's either going to enhance their curl or it's going to make their frizz come out, right? So this blade, it's just the blade, it's just a piece of metal. How you use it is going to dictate your haircut, right? So always use it wisely and think about the blade and think about the movement that you're creating. All right, so now we're ready to start our tutorial. Here's my sectioning. This is going to be the fringe area. My section went from the top of the round of the head right to the outside of recession. The second section is going to be from the same point of the head to right to behind the ear.
Yep.
We're going to take the fringe area, so the first section, and we're going to divide this area in 3 sections. Section 1, and then divide this in half. So I'm going to go ahead and use the shortest piece as just above the tip of the nose, right to just below the cheekbones. So to create my first section, I'm going to be using closed blade, and I'm going to create a line that's going to go from shorter to slightly longer. Lift your section just a little tiny bit off of the skin. place your fingers at the desired length, right? So remember, when we're using a blade, we are cutting above our fingers, not below, which means I want to see where my guide is going to be and then slide my fingers so that the guide and the area that I'll be cutting is going to be above my fingers. The cutting line is going to be a gradual triangular shape, which means the length between my knuckles is going to be longer than the length between my fingertips. I want to stand directly in front of the client. I'm going to place the blade at a diagonal at about 45 degrees, and my stroke is going to be closed. That's going to be the strength of the haircut. The more closed the blade is, the more precise your line is going to be, right? So look at the line that I created. It's pretty strong. I'm going to do the same thing on the opposite side. I'm going to take a little piece from the area that I already cut, because that's going to be my guide. I'm going to again stand directly in front of the client. I want to make sure that my body position is not making me over direct the hair. Stand in front. Now my fingertips are going to be tilted just a little bit lower. Slide my fingers past the guide. I want to see that guide in front of my fingers right here. And I also want it to almost like fall out of my fingers, because this way I know I'm not going to be cutting it. Place the blade the opposite direction, right? So we're still going to go from short to long. Place it at 45 degrees. And the blade is still going to be closed. So be careful not to put too much tension onto the hair, because if you do, you're going to either push on the hair or your fingers are going to slide out. So I have this one little guy right here. Cut that off. And then here is my first section. So now I'm going to take this next section, comb this down, divide it in the middle, right in the center. Move the section that I'm not cutting out of the way. Stand directly in front once again. Now I'm going to lift a little tiny bit higher. I'm going to find my guide. So here's my guide. I'm going to let my fingers slide through so that I can see my guide. Now I'm going to do the same thing and I'm going to follow the same guide, but instead of keeping my blade closed, I'm going to open it. So my starting point is I'm going to be about 1/2 inch below the guide, which means I'm going to place the blade right at the guide and then go all the way to my fingers. So I'm creating strength in the first section, softness on the middle section, and then lots of looseness on the top. The reason why I chose this technique and I chose to do strength on the bottom is because if a client has any cowlicks or any imperfections in their hairline, the strength of the haircut is going to keep that hairline down and it's going to keep the hair down. If I remove a lot of weight from that first initial section, most likely her hair is going to spring up quite a bit. So I have to be very careful of that. Doll heads have the worst hairlines, right? They pop up quite a bit. You guys can already tell. She's still wet and look at all that volume that she's getting. So I have to be really, really careful and pretend this is a real life scenario and this is a client, right? So that's why I chose to do that. Now the last section, it's much smaller because it's a little triangle on the top, but I still want to do the same thing. I'm going to lift a little tiny bit higher. So elevate a little bit more. Find my guide. Find the longest pieces right there. Slide through. Watch my longest pieces be in front of my fingers. Starting point is going to be the same as previous. So my starting point is always going to be whatever is the shortest piece from the underneath. And then my longest piece on the last third section is just a little bit longer than the section number 2. So I'm gradually getting longer with the longest piece, but my starting point is always the same. So this way there's a little bit of a connection and a soft disconnection. When we're all done, look at all that movement that I created, and you'll have a little bit of that wing that is very sexy and very attractive, and the reason why this fringe is called current fringe. Beautiful. Section number 2, we're going to let this hair down and we're going to separate this section in half. The first section is going to be closed blade. Again, that's going to give us the strength of the face frame. And then the following section is going to be slightly looser and the blade is going to be a little bit more open. I'm going to use the longest piece coming from the fringe as my guide. So find your guide, find it in your fingers, let your fingers slide. So that's going to be my shortest piece. From that point, I'm going to go right into the overall length. So the length that I'm creating, or the shape that I'm creating of the face frame, is going to be quite severe triangular shape, which means I'm going to have to glide my fingers and slide them down as I'm cutting this. So here's my guide, right through here. So I'm going to hold my blade almost perpendicular to the hair. And then from this point, I'm going to do tiny little strokes, and then glide my fingers all the way, nice and slow, until I reach my overall length. So the line that I created went from my existing fringe all the way down to my existing length. So quite severe, but look how beautiful it looks. Let's do that same thing on the opposite side. Now that we've finished the face frame on both sides, let's cross-check. We're going to take hair from the same points of the head, bring it in front, and we're checking for balance of the haircut. Pick another piece, bring it towards the front, and cross-check for balance. Be careful not to watch for perfection, because we didn't use a scissor, we used a feather razor. And the last section of our face frame, we're going to bring all of that hair forward, find the guide underneath, make sure our fingers are sliding past the guide. We're going to use the guide that we see underneath, but we're going to keep our blade slightly more open. Remember to slide your fingers as you're moving your blade to achieve the triangular shape and the short to long movement that were created underneath. So with our second section, we're still following the guide from underneath, but now we're making it a little bit softer. Another movement I'd like to go over is peeling. Peeling is removing a weight and length together while creating elevation. So peeling is placing the blade parallel to the hair with the thumb on the other side of the section, and then one swift move, we're going to move the blade, push the hair against the blade, and remove it. So I'm going to have the camera come a little bit closer and really zoom in on that move. Flat and remove. Make sure there's a lot of tension on the hair. flat, squeeze, remove. The next step is adding layers. The first section that we're going to do is going to be a center part. So that's going to be our mohawk section. We're going to elevate the hair all the way up and find the guide that's coming from our fringe. So that's too much hair for me to hold. And I'm going to take a little bit more of this hair so that I know exactly where that fringe is finishing up. So you guys can tell these are my shortest pieces. So I'm going to create the line that's going to be parallel to the floor, and then I'm going to extend all the way slightly lower so it's a little bit more rounded until I run out of hair to cut. So I'm going to hold that hair all the way up, elevation directly towards the ceiling, find my guide, leave a little bit more room in front of my fingers so I have enough room for a peeling motion, place the blade flat against the hair, and then use my thumb to remove that hair. Make sure you have a new blade as you're doing this. Next motion is going to be slightly lower elevation. So I'm almost like following the head shape as I'm doing this. I'm going to speed up the motion just a little bit because I find that it's a little bit easier to create a perfect peeling motion when you are going a little bit faster. Next part, I'm going to take my vertical section all the way, but I know most of that hair is not going to reach, so I don't have to worry about sectioning it all the way down to the bottom of the nape and the hairline. So here's my next part of the section. Elevation, slightly following the head shape. Peel. And the last little bit until I run out of hair to cut. And then here I am. So on the doll head, it is a little bit more difficult to do the peeling motion, but I promise if you practice on the doll head, it is so much easier on a client. So my next section, I'm going to follow. I'm going to take another vertical section or horizontal if you're looking from the side. I'm going to combine the two sections together. So now if you guys watched our previous virtual classroom and there was a long layered haircut, we elevated everything into the center. So now instead of staying stationary, we're going to be moving with each section. So now my elevation is going to change and so will my over direction. So here's the peeling motion, square cutting line. The next portion is going to be elevation following the head shape. And with this section, instead of bringing it into the center, I'm bringing it just a little bit towards you guys. Which means the second section that I'm cutting is the same length as the first section. Where if I over-directed the sections into the center, then my length would gradually get longer and longer the farther down it goes. Now my length from the top of the head towards the bottom going this way, is also getting longer. So we're going to change the angle of the camera so you guys can see my elevation from a side. I'm going to separate the two sections, remove the middle, take another section mirroring the previous, move that hair out of the way. I'm going to stand now on the opposite side to make my life a little bit easier. Here's my elevation. Find the guide between my fingers. Peel. Change my elevation to follow the head shape. Peel once again. And then continue until I run out of hair to cut. So if someone's hair is shorter, overall length is shorter, most likely you'll run out of hair to cut much faster. If someone's hair is much longer and you don't want to remove the weight from the underneath, you might want to change your elevation and keep it all the way up here instead of following the head shape. And the last section that I'm going to take is going to be all the way. And my now elevation is going to stay the same as what I did in my third section. The reason for it is I don't want to remove too much the overall length. The more head following I'll be doing, the more overall length I will remove. So which means I'm going to stay stationary for the last two sections. Find your guide, peel, comb all of the hair into the same elevation where you kept your fingers on the previous section. So let's recap. First section was all the way up. Second section on base, exactly where hair grows from. Third section was again on base. And the fourth section and the last section was slightly higher where it lives and it was over directed into the previous. Let's do the same thing on the opposite side. Now that we finished all of the layers, all we have to do is just skim the ends to make the haircut look finished. And that is going to be up to you and to what your client is desired with the overall length. So I'm going to go with somewhere just underneath the base of the dowel head. I think that would be a really good length for the layers. I'm going to hold my fingers parallel to the floor because that is the cutting line that I want to create. I'm going to place my blade flat against the hair, 45-degree angle, and I'm going to keep it pretty closed because I want this haircut to look really healthy on the ends and not too textured. The reason why I'm not sectioning this is because most of this haircut was already cut, right? The layers are kind of going from here up, so I don't have to subsection it. I have just enough hair where I can do this in one shot. Hope you guys enjoyed this tutorial, and keep in mind that this haircut can always be altered by changing your elevation, your over direction, and your strokes of the blade. I'll see you soon.